Hello and welcome, dear friends. Today we are going to discuss modernism. Though an artistic and cultural movement of wide-ranging consequences, modernism is not easy to define precisely because, as Kevin Detmer has remarked, it was never really one thing and never really unified. It has been associated variously with either a period in time, a specific kind of style, and even a variety of genre category. Because of this, right from 1960 onwards, several critics have suggested that there is no single modernism, but several modernisms, depending on how one approaches it. Literary historians go to the extent of stating that though we have moved away from modernism into postmodernism, and perhaps even beyond that, a bit of modernism survives even now. And considering that modernism is being subjected to a constant revision and revaluation, critics like Michael Levinson have stated that its distortions and oversimplifications are becoming increasingly visible, and many of the earlier assertions about it are being challenged. In spite of these varying opinions which arise from what modernism is actually like, it is true, and one could state without any fear of controversy, that modernism was, or modernisms were, marked by a big change in social organization and thinking, and embraced virtually all aspects of the world of art, like painting, music, architecture, and literature. Several distinguished poets, novelists, and dramatists have always been considered modernist writers. Keeping this in view, the first of the two lectures on modernism have 5 main objectives. 1. To consider modernism as a movement of big changes. 2. To chart the beginnings of modernism in England and Europe in 2 phases. 3. The cultural and literary scene before the advent of modernism. 4. Karl Marx and Charles Darwin as shapers of modernism. And 5. Friedrich Nietzsche and Albert Einstein as shapers of modernism. In the evolutionary process of societies and their cultures, changes are quite natural. But from time to time, because of varied reasons, these changes acquire massive proportions and affect each and every aspect of society, and also the thinking and creative endeavors of the people living in them. Modernism is an example of one such change, which has been characterized by Philip Tew and Alex Murray as a kind of cultural and aesthetic revolution, a massive rupture from the past, and marked by what Levinson calls creative violence. The 3 expressions that have been used by critics and culture historians to describe the movement of modernism, revolution, rupture, creative violence, suggest that the changes in all aspects of society have marked a big break from what had existed till then. A study of what it was like prior to the movement will help in understanding the true character of modernism. But before that, there is need to know when these changes happened for the first time and how long did they last. Culture and literary critics have suggested different dates to mark the beginnings of modernism, such as 1872 and 1874, and a few years around that, which were marked by developments in physical sciences or related to Baudelaire's description of an era that is concerned with the contingent than with the eternal. However, the most generally accepted frame for the modernist movement is reckoned between the last decade of the 19th century and the middle of the 20th century. Since the movement took some time to gain the shape that was seen in its fullness in its later years, some historians see it in 2 phases. In the early phase, roughly from 1890 to 1910, marked changes became visible in the fields of science, music, painting, and literature, in the works of poets like Charles Baudelaire and painters like Edouard Manet, And since these changes heralded an advance over what existed previously in these different fields, this phase is also designated avant-garde. From 1910 onwards, the changes picked speed, generating a wave of new explosive experimentations in the fields of art and literature, as seen in the rise of Futurism, Dadaism, Surrealism, Cubism, and many others, when Ezra Pound signaled a total break from the past by his slogan, "Make it new," and Theodor Adorno challenged the reason-dominated thinking characterized by coherence and harmony, and the paintings touched a new high of Impressionism in the work of Pablo Picasso and several others. Because of this, the movement changed into full-fledged modernism. Some critics use modernism for the first avant-garde phase and call the second one the phase of high modernism. Since modernism marked a break from what had existed prior to that, it is important to know what was there till the time of its beginning and what influences initiated changes that eventually led to this growth. This will also help in understanding whether the idea of modernism being a total break from the past is really true or not. Before modernism came into its own, the worldview was largely dominated by what is called the Enlightenment thinking. Some historians reckon its beginning from the times of the Renaissance in Europe in the 15th century and a little later in England, which brought about significant changes in virtually all aspects of human endeavor. People were released from the grip of the church on their thinking, which opened the doors of new knowledge and spurred individual ambition. This marked the transition from the medieval to the modern. The new forces of human endeavor released by the Renaissance led to the strengthening of the primacy of reason in human lives in the 18th century. The rise of science as a source of knowledge for improving the understanding of the world, and a steady belief among people in the idea of progress. Freed from well-entrenched subjections, either of institutions or of divine forces, human beings put their trust in control-free life, in the primacy of reason and the benefits of science and technology to foster belief that civilization does and can move ahead in a desired forward movement which can usher in progress and the well-being of one and all. They believed that individuals will be guided by their enlightened self-interest to create an ordered society which can lay a firm basis for human happiness. This also coincided with the growth of capitalist economy in which technology helped in promoting the greatest good of all people. Connected with this was also the notion that the world around was knowable because human beings were well equipped with sensory apparatus, and the main task of writers is to imitate this world in their works, creating the elaborate framework of realism. The growth of Romanticism in Europe and England made some changes in this thinking, for it stressed the role of human subjectivity, which marked a shift in the mode of knowing and creating many doubts about some of the assumptions of the previous mode of thinking. But because the promise of Romanticism did not come true, and the hope of political changes that it was meant to induce did not happen, the idea that reality dominates over subjective impressions gained momentum and became the hallmark of the Victorian era in England. Movements like modernism are invariably preceded by a ferment of ideas that result in altering people's understanding of the world they live in, denoted sometimes by the word reality, which impacts the arts, especially the painters and writers, on the content and form of their work. In the 19th century, a number of influential thinkers from different fields of knowledge contributed to the growth of awareness that altered the understanding of people about their world, which contributed towards changing the shape and nature of the Victorian era in Britain and paved way for the early phase of modernism. The most prominent thinkers from different fields of knowledge whose contribution made that happen and has been accepted by virtually all the critics and historians are discussed in what follows in this presentation. The person who made a big dent in the rosy picture of modernity was Karl Marx's serious and penetrating study of the capitalist system. He conceded that the rise of capitalist economy had brought gains in its initial stage by putting an end to the feudalism of the medieval times, but it had also brought with it many serious problems that were responsible for disrupting social cohesion and communal identity of people. Marx pointed out that the capitalist society carries within it the seeds of multiple crises, which are closely related to the continuous struggle of classes within the system. He pointed out that the rise and expansion of industrialization that was considered the basis of progress and advancement and a guarantee of the greatest good of the greatest number was based on an inadequate understanding of the system itself. For the fact is that in its later stages, the system creates a big gulf between the capitalist and the proletariat, which results in the exploitation of the latter. Signs of this social disruption and the conflict that it produced in the dreamed organic society permeates the mood of the writings of virtually all the major poets and novelists of the modernist era, such as T.S. Eliot, D.H. Lawrence, W.B. Yeats, and several others. Because of the increased use of technology which led to migration of people from rural areas to towns and cities, there was a rise in urban living which bred a new urban crisis that was compounded by the growth of market economy and a commodity culture in which individuals too were commodified. This new awareness about the nature of the society that people had celebrated as one of great promise and full of bright possibilities led to diverse reactions from artists and writers. Many writers shifted their gaze from the externals of the social system to the inner minds of the characters inhabiting their fictional universe, wherein they resort to introspection, shifting the focus to their inner consciousness. But things did not stop there. It bred several kinds of reactions that are associated with modernist writings. Since the very idea of history and the modes of historical understanding induced only negativity, many writers moved away from the writer's serious engagement with history that became a significant characteristic of the modern age. History, in fact, turned into a virtual nightmare. Social and historical details were used by writers in their works only for providing an appropriate backdrop for human actions. Glimpses of this can be seen in the fiction of James Joyce, for example. Many writers chose to retreat into the world of art and dissociating it totally with social concerns, which fostered the movement of art for art's sake. This is largely associated with writers like Charles Baudelaire and Oscar Wilde, though a bit of this can be seen in Joyce too, especially in his portrait. Some writers like Bertolt Brecht accepted Marxian understanding of society in a positive spirit. Instead of retreating into the world of art, he advocated that art be used to bring out the deformities of the system as unfair and condemnable. And for this, he created many innovative dramatic techniques that are now associated with his name. Another major influence was Charles Darwin, who shook the very foundations of the Christian belief about the role of the divine in human lives by giving a new theory of the origin of human species, in which the development of the society is the result of what he called the principle of natural selection. Society moves because of the survival of the fittest, and in this humans are very close to the animals and not made in God's image as they had believed for centuries. Since old beliefs related to human evolution and the advancement of societies were overthrown by the theory of Darwin, possibilities of weaving narratives from this new knowledge became quite common, as for example in H.G. Wells's The Time Machine, though cast in the older mode of fiction. Its modernist version is Dostoevsky's Notes from the Underground, in which the same theme is treated by using new modes of presentation. Darwin's theory strengthened the shift in writers' engagement from external reality to the inner reality of the individual centered in his inner consciousness. The focus on biology helped the cause of imperialists as well, for the biologists established that non-whites or non-Europeans were either degenerate or underdeveloped, thus providing the colonials a moral right to control the native populations from different parts of the world, laying the basis of racism and exploitation. Another person who complemented the work of Marx and Darwin was Sigmund Freud, who gave theories about the working of the human mind and created a new awareness about the manner in which it works. It encouraged writers to explore the hidden depths of human desires and drives, and also how people suffer because of their failure to deal with them. Writers also distinguished between horological time and psychological time, the former measured by clock time and the latter by the duration within which the mind makes sense of the experiences which occupy its attention. Writers increasingly felt that reality is not outside of oneself, but is shaped by memory, and because of that, human self is fragmented and fluid. The flow of thought in the mind is like a continuously moving stream, a stream of consciousness, as William James put it. This gave new depth to the portrayal of human character in the work of all the major novelists of the time. Among the philosophers, the most influential is Nietzsche, who was greatly influenced by the work of another philosopher, Arthur Schopenhauer. He encouraged the spirit of self-scrutiny, which is at the center of modernist movement, and also added to the push for aesthetic domination. His influence is quite evident in the field of politics, art, as well as literature. In his view, the world exists only in the aesthetic because the other force, be it divine or natural or supernatural, has no role in it. He declared that God is dead. The artist has therefore no moral obligations. He has only to meet the demands of aesthetics, and this helped in laying the basis of secular literature. By stating that God has no role in human lives, Nietzsche virtually denied the basis of social and ethical values that had provided an assured base to people for centuries. This created scope for relativism, and writers in particular chose to create their own variants of aesthetics. It also created possibilities of nihilism and alienation and accounted for a sense of gloom that pervades some modernist writings. Taking a cue from the theories of Schopenhauer that underlying the cosmic reality is will, which quite often produced sickness and morbidity because the humans could not deal with it in a positive way. This led Nietzsche to formulate his theory of the overman, who had the ability to transcend the limitations that affect human action because of their adherence to the dictates of religion, morality, and society, and thus become what one is. Thus, nihilism has two variants, the active and the passive one. In the active mold, it marks an increase in the powers of the spirit. In the negative mold, these powers are diminished, which leads to a sense of futility and becomes the cause of pessimism. Nietzsche also held that people had lost touch with tragic myths, especially those of the Greeks, in which he suggested the two opposing spheres of art, the Apollonian and the Dionysian, named after their two gods. The first one emphasizes control and form, and the second one intoxication and exuberance that invariably turns destructive. This made Nietzsche say that art alone can cure the disharmony of the present. This also accounts for the influence of anthropology on the modernist art, in which work was done by a group of learned anthropologists, the most influential being James Frazer, whose book, The Golden Bough, was published in 1890. By piecing together fragments from myths of different cultures, he evolved a parent myth in which the well-being of people gets associated with their king, who has to be killed before he suffers degeneration. Like Freud and Darwin, Frazer also dealt with human evolution in terms of how, in early times, they controlled events through rituals and later through science. This stimulated the idea of organizing experience by using myth, which strengthened the growth of mythopoeic imagination, which is at the heart of much modernist poetry, like that of Eliot and Yeats, and also of the fiction of Joyce. Advances in the field of science, especially the work of Albert Einstein, also changed the outlook of the modernist artists. Through his work, he changed the very concept of the physical universe. Earlier on, the universe was based on Newtonian physics, in which everything was well arranged and represented symbolically by the clock. This helped people in viewing and understanding the world in a similar way, and was reflected in the stable fictional worlds of the novelists with objective narratives, in which it was possible to predict human behavior. Einstein's theory of relativity changed the idea of stability by proposing that there are no absolutes and nothing is reliable. What is known is determined by the position of the observer. Coupled with the quantum theory of Max Planck and the uncertainty principle of Werner Heisenberg, the advances in science affected the writers too, almost in the same way in which advances in astronomy affected the writings of poets like John Donne in the Renaissance times. The stable narratives of the modern era gave way to the narratives of James, Proust, Conrad, and Woolf, where the focus is on individual consciousness, characterized by technical innovations like the stream of consciousness in Woolf and imagism and epiphanies in Joyce. Peter Childs points out how literary theorists like Bakhtin learned from the space-time continuum of Einstein to develop his concept of chronotope, a combination of chronology and topology in his dialogic imagination. The idea of individual subjectivity as a source of knowledge was further strengthened by Ferdinand Saussure's views on language, when he said that subjects are inscribed in the language, though their full impact of his views was felt much later. Okay, with this, we come to the end of today's lecture. Hope you have understood it well. We shall meet again with a new topic. Until then, take very good care of yourself. Thank you for watching.